You're listening to CAHOOT Auditory Theater. Curiously strange, remarkably human. Episode 5. The Game.
I stared wistfully over the side of the ship, a look heavy with optimism and fire, the kind only the young can still muster. The wind whistled through the sails, whipping my long hair across my face. I can still smell the sting of the pine tar from the freshly sealed vessel, growing hot in the midday sun. As we drifted into port, I did not know it, but this would be my last beautiful memory. I could see the peninsula now on the horizon, one place on the continent I had never been. I was still a wanderer at that time, and in the dozen years prior I had visited so many cities I could no longer recall all their names. Yet, like so many other survivors of the war yet to come, my recollection of certain periods of my life is still covered in a dense fog that refuses to lift from the shores of my memory. Some details may seem altogether impossible to hold on to. But this moment, as I recount it to you now, remembering myself on the deck of the Radagast, the wide leather lapels of my crimson overcoat catching the crosswind, my linen shirt exposed to the midday sun, I remember it all so clearly. Clear as the crystal sky overhead or the sea air that filled me with longing. Longing for a better life. A simple, unattainable longing for safety and security. The kind only the wealthy can afford. I reached fast to steady myself on the rail as the bow of the ship fell down hard into the water as we entered the bay. I exhaled, slowly, steadying my nerves, and pulled my nails from the wooden banister to wipe the spray from my face.
Have a nice bath, pretty boy.
Mott, a round stump of a sailor who had taken a considerable disliking towards me, was snickering openly in my direction. Sounded more like a barrel scraping across the deck than a laugh. Apparently, my coin was not enough to purchase courtesy in addition to passage on this vessel. One evening, below deck, Mott had caught a glimpse of my tiles pouch as I was rearranging my pack. My young self was racked with regret over the foolish mistake. I chided myself for days over my carelessness. At that age, I could never allow myself as much grace and patience as I afforded to others. But it could be dangerous in that part of the continent to be known as a player of the game. Close to the old capital, it was still illegal to even own tiles, and the game was still believed by many to be synonymous with the old ways, and allegiance to the old lord. A simplistic point of view, to be sure, but a dangerous one. Still reeling from the drop of the ship and reminded of my precarious situation in this place, all I could do was wave sheepishly back at the deckhand's insult, turn, and walk away. I retreated to the bow of the ship to better see our landing. As we approached, a cold wall of shadow began to move across the deck. The island's bridge was suddenly looming high above. I was so consumed by my thoughts, I had not noticed our progress through the bay had caused the bridge to grow larger and larger as we neared, until its massive shadow consumed us. I had never seen anything like it. This ancient structure is one of few still standing from the earliest recorded days of the continent. Its massive columns still supported the ancient arches as effortlessly today as they have for hundreds of years. The ghostly hue of the stone bridge and the jagged shores on either side reflected in the water, making this section of the sound appear a ghastly white, and the island's bridge seem as if it rose out of a great trench in the sea. It looked even more imposing in person than I ever imagined. I could hear the voice of my mother whispering in the dark, her face shrouded in darkness, telling me stories of the old capital. After all those years, I could hardly make out her face anymore, but those whispers stuck in my mind. Not a single person traversed the only crossing between the mainland and the island. Before the last war, this narrow expanse would have been packed with throngs of merchants, pilgrims, high nobility, and common folk alike. All would have to undergo this crossing before stepping foot on the continent's ancient seat of power. A climb intended to humble those who wished to enter the halls of the old lord. There was no port on the island. The old lord has seen to it that this bottleneck was the only access point in case war would ever come to unseat him and end his reign. Cliffs and sharp crags surrounded the island, and this spot was chosen to ensure the continent's old capital would be impregnable. But it made no difference to the turning wheel of history, which did unseat the old lord, despite his plans and schemes. The bridge, the island, and the fortress nestled deep within were cut off from the world and left deserted, placed out of sight by the new alliance as a reminder that the past is best left forgotten. Of course, the people of the peninsula had new stories mothers told their children, whispered in the dark, about ghouls and phantoms who made the ruins their home and await the return of their lord. Such things people only ever talked about in whispers, and no one dared step a single toe across the island's bridge. A shiver crept up my spine from the small of my back. Passing beneath these towering pillars sent my young mind racing with my mother's tales of the old times from long before I was born. Of the ancient magic said to have been used in the construction of the bridge, of the more than masons who were said to have inlaid runes of protection into the keystone of the fortress. But the truth of these secrets has long since faded with time, like a colorful silk in the sun. Only whispers now remain of what was. I wanted so badly then to be a part of something as massive as these monuments, to build something, anything that could last the test of time as this bridge had. To have stories told generations later about how I had been there, anywhere, and had done something great. I wanted to be remembered. And who amongst you can blame me for that? Can any of you truthfully say you would have done differently than I did? I was a boy with too much ambition, far too high an opinion of my merits, and yet a deep fear that was always with me and drove my every action, far stronger than my ambition. My fear that I was and always would be somehow unworthy.
Port ho!
Maud had climbed to the crow's nest and was hailing our long-awaited approach toward land. My last days at sea had grown longer with every sunrise. My anticipation of the game that awaited could barely be contained, and I was eager to be away from the squinted, prying eyes of the deckhand and once again feel the relief of anonymity. The peninsula was, at that time, still the most accessible port for the southern cities to move goods, and I was not the only one coming to this metropolis hoping to make my fortune. My smooth jaw dropped in astonishment at what looked like hundreds of merchant ships bobbing anchored in the harbor, packed as tightly together as the market stalls in the street. The tall ships sat so closely to each other that I could scarcely imagine what would be done if one in the center of the group wished to set sail. Those last hours on board the Radagast seemed without end. I tore myself in two, feeling incredibly small as I watched the city grow closer. But the smaller I felt, the more hardened I became to set myself to what I came there to do and finally be free to live the life I thought I wanted. free from care and worry. What a notion that coin could ever buy a life free from these things. But the young will not be deterred. And to distract myself from the difficulties ahead, I set to planning out my first steps in that once so unfamiliar land. From the moment my boots first touched the dock, I was stopped in my tracks. The sheer number of people astounded me. Bulging through the streets in every direction, passengers arriving from distant cities, carts of goods being loaded and unloaded, a ballet of commerce. On the peninsula, one can find a fruit from every forest that grows on land, or a fish from any sea. You can just as easily find a believer of any creed, or a resident from any corner of the world. The rush of the crowd was exhilarating. This was the largest city I had ever been to, and even then, it was starting to feel like home. But I only afforded myself a moment to take in the cacophonous symphony. Never get caught looking like a stranger, even when you are one. I had had my share of trouble in my travels, and I was no longer a fool. Certain mantras like this one had become second nature to me. This sad reality of walking through life alone had taught me something. No one welcomes the stranger. I whispered it to myself as I slipped quickly and quietly away from the docks in the direction my information had provided, before I caught any more unwanted attention. One disgruntled sailor is enough for one journey. If you walk like you belong, no one will have any reason to assume you don't. Another mantra. This one proved to be more difficult today. The alleys of the peninsula curve and weave together with no discernible logic, as if a horse drunk on honey ale had made the map of the city one night on a whim. The streets, only slightly larger, crisscross at seemingly random intersections, connecting the web of districts together from the north to the south. That day, rows and rows of huge red paper lanterns hung suspended from wires above the narrow, cracked dirt path. For what occasion, I still do not know. Even in the evening sun, they cast dim circles of light on the heads of the crowd below. Although, that day, to me, these streets seemed to have a glow all of their own. The market streets were even more packed than the docks, and I had to find a current of pedestrians that was moving in my direction and enter it to get anywhere. Both sides of the alley were lined with wooden stalls, strapped together and covered in thick flapping fabrics to shield the merchants from the hottest of the midday sun. Scores of shoppers stood on each side of the narrow throughway, haggling with various merchants over everything from trinkets to tridents. Their commerce made it even more difficult to find my way. The narrowing flow of traffic left me gawking like a baby in all directions for a way through the torrent. I could not make heads or tails of how to move in the direction my sources had pointed me. My inexperience was showing, and I knew if I didn't figure out my place in the chaos, I would turn into someone's mark. Crowd or not, a word from a kind merchant was usually enough to get my bearings. But as I searched for a friendly face, instead, I found an unwelcome one. Mott, meandering about 30 marks behind me, pretending to feel for a ripe melon while looking in my direction. Despite my efforts to discreetly depart from the docks, that bucket of chum must have followed me. My carelessness had ultimately resulted in trouble for me after all. There was enough anger and resentment left against the old ways that there were factions in certain pockets of the continent that believed every trace of it should be wiped out, including players of the game. And I had no wish to get caught up with one. I dropped closer to the vendors and stood just behind a flapping awning to scan the crowd. Where there's one cockroach. They were easy to spot once I was looking. My instincts were finally kicking in. 4 more sailors from the Radagast were scattered about the alleyway, eyes darting about, looking for me and my bag of tiles, presumably. It was time to disappear. Staying low behind the row of stalls, I crept away from the mob, slipped a coin to a merchant, so they would point me in the direction of the front for the game hall, the stone's throw. It was time for me to be out of the public eye. No more wandering around like a tourist. There was work to do.
Where'd he go?
Don't tell me you fools lost him.
I lost him, sorry.
Look down that way.
Oh, if he gets away.
I can't see him.
Damn it.
I can't see shit.
Bloody hell.
The grumblings of the thwarted sailors faded into the crowd noise behind me as I slipped into a dark alley headed towards my prize. I finally stepped into the stone's throw, tucked into the dead end of a dark and unpopulated alley, and patted the dust off myself. I immediately set to my trade, but I reminded myself, this time is different. I came to the peninsula not to add another link to my never-ending chain of conquests, but to, at long last, affix the clasp and hang my life's work about my neck to adorn myself in beauty for the rest of my days. I had heard stories of a gambler of the greatest skill who played only on the peninsula. He called himself only the gamesman, a title reserved only for the most elite players. Even I never used the title of gamesman, mostly not to scare away the sheep who patted my coin purse, but it was said that the gamesman offers all his years of winnings, treasures untold, to anyone who could beat him. And he had never been defeated. If this was true, as the whispers of countless game halls across the continent had led me to believe, this could be my last game. A win such as this could have held the promise of retirement and an end to my ceaseless travels in search of another purse. In every city, I played out the same strategy. I never wasted time with any player. I only challenged the best. The best are most willing to wager, and though usually boastful, they were the least likely to speak of their loss at my tiles. By the nature of this strategy of mine, I could never stay in one place for too long. The opponent pool dried up quicker than I might hope, and eventually word of my winnings would spread through the game hall, and no one would play me. Or at worst, I would be accused as a cheat and run out of town. Fear of the stranger is a fear that runs through too many hearts in this world. But, standing there, under the cool layers of canvas draped across the many rooms of what should be the largest game hall on the peninsula, I began to doubt whether such a treasure could truly exist in this place. The larger the city, the more greed there is to be found. But looking into the deep rooms of the stone's throw, there was not a single miscreant in sight. No game boards, no game. Could my information have been wrong? Excuse me, miss? I addressed the barmaid.
Yes, sir.
I'm in search of some revelry. Am I in the right place? A clear code for anyone familiar with secret game halls. She stiffened before she answered.
I'm sure I don't know what you mean.
And she turned abruptly, walking to the far side of the far room, and flashed me a knowing look before opening a heavy wood door and disappearing into a tunnel behind it, conspicuously leaving the door ajar. I smiled. I followed. Halfway down the long, dimly lit corridor, I started to feel at home. The raucous sounds of the game danced down the corridor to meet me, wrapping me in its music. Tiles being slapped, coins being tossed in piles, screams of joy and loss. Behind another heavy door, I found what I had came for. A sight for sore eyes. By far the largest game hall I've seen in all my travels. I'm surrounded by the foul reek of old ale and sweat. I can barely see through the pipe smoke. The barmaid from upstairs returned with a mug of ale on a tray and a wry smile.
First one's in the house. Best of luck to ya.
I set to work. I must remind myself of the stories, repeating them to myself, an affirmation of my plan. Gamblers and gawkers pass by in throngs, but the gamesman will play none of them. The gamesman will play only to be beaten. The gamesman is truly alone amongst the squabbling masses. With this recitation, and my purpose renewed, I scanned the hall in front of me. Without a question in my mind, I spotted the man himself. How could I have not recognized the one I have imagined so many times? He was sitting along the edge of the main room, alone, staring down a mug towards a game board without even a glance upward to find a partner, and none dared approach to challenge him. The crowd thinned towards his table as the patrons elected to give this legend a wide berth. Who else could this be, if not the gamesman? I breathed in slowly to steady my nerves, placed a hand in my left pocket, slowly flipped a tile across my right knuckles, and approached. His eyes did not even lift to take me in when I stopped across from him at his board. Now that I'm closer, I can see a small gold clasp holding his green cloak at his neck. It's cast in the shape of a game tile, and his only visible piece of finery. I remember thinking how bold this was, to brandish an illegal tile so brazenly. I stood across from him for some time, yet he did not acknowledge me. His gaze remained stoically down over his half-filled mug, in the direction of the game board. I would have thought him asleep if he had not continued to tap his forefinger steadily, rhythmically, on the edge of the table. Our game had already begun, and after waiting in silence for what I considered to be an acceptable amount of time to counter this first play of his, I spoke. They say the gamesman is the best that ever played, yet will play no one. He continued tapping his finger and did not look up. They say he's never lost a game. The finger tapped on, undisturbed. They say he cheats, but no one knows how. The finger stopped. He smiled, a small, thin smile. Got him. They say the same about me. At this, he looked up. Only his eyes, slowly scanning from the table up my form and landing directly on my eyes. I could see then the sharpness in those eyes that looked back into mine. Piercing green, brighter by far than his worn cloak, but having seen many more storms. His smile grew.
And so, you have come to me with the promise that all my riches could be yours if only you can play the game and best me. When I first arrived on the peninsula, everyone flocked to me to try their hand at winning riches from my chest of treasures. A sea of them looking to make it rich, not interested in the game for its beauty, its simplicity, its elegance. Not like you. The city dwellers are enticed only by dangling baubles and shiny trinkets. They stay away now that they think me a cheat. But I think that you know better. You who have entered this place in search of me from afar. I was alone before you arrived, but if only you could best me, if only you could sit here and understand the true nature of the game. We shall see. It has been many weeks since someone has sat at my table, drank my tea. Shall you have a cup of tea? Shall we play? All my riches could be yours, if only you can play the game and best me. I was alone before you arrived, but you are no greedy street rats, only out for riches. Come, sit at my table, under the dimming lanterns, drink my tea and play to best me.
His immediate candor took me by surprise. I was out for his riches, but I did not like the comparison to a street rat. Nonetheless, I sat, laid out my own tiles, and we began to play. We placed our tiles with intense care and precision, and at an incredible speed, neither of us waiting on the other before our next move. We drew, discarded, and placed our tiles in such synchronicity it became almost as if the two of us were stepping in time to a dance that only we knew. The 5 points of the board began to fill with patterns familiar to the game. Yet, as the tiles began to move and shape themselves according to their surrounding tiles, the shapes they formed, usually random, began to seem less and less so. A crowd had formed around the two of us now. No doubt the game master accepting an opponent was quite an event for the locals. The tessellation of our tiles transfixed all those in the cloth-covered enclosure. The shifting, moving of their own will was as frequent and rhythmic as can only be seen in a truly great display of skill. When the tempo of the sliding, flashing tiles seemed like it could not possibly move any faster, or the board itself might be sent off the table, a dim, distinctive glow began to emanate from beneath the shifting tiles. It cast strange shadows which danced in rhythm to the game on the draped ceiling. An eerie, incandescent glow began to come from the game board itself. A pale blue luminescence which flickered with each sliding tile. My jaw slowly lowered, leaving my mouth agape at the sight in front of me. I scanned the board for signs of some trickery, my eyes nearly as wide as my mouth. A light source hidden below the ashen table, perhaps. Some more than runes carved into its surface to indicate some strange spell at work. But I could find neither. I only then realized that this was no normal game. I was finally able to peel my straining pupils away from the game board. They rose to meet the face of the gamesman, who, to my great surprise, was not gawking at the impossible spectacle before us, but was, instead, staring directly at me. The gamesman stared at me not with the hard features of a man shocked or startled, but with wonderment, like a mother seeing her only son for the first time after returning from the war, a son she had long thought dead. And then he spoke.
"It is you, as I am me."
This is all he was able to whisper before the light from the board blinked out, along with every other light in the gambling hall, as a great gust of wind tore through the place, turning over tables and customers alike, and leaving us all in the dark.
Thank you for listening to The Game. Written by Chase Perkins. Directed and edited by Eric William Jones. Cast members, in order of appearance: Chase Perkins, Graham Casper Haught, Emilia Bjork Perkins, and Eric William Jones. To listen to other episodes of CAHOOT Auditory Theater, make sure to follow us on Spotify, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check us out at cahootphysicaltheater.org/cat.